Martha Miller calculated everything meticulously. The forest location 4.2 miles from the nearest road. The overnight temperature forecast of 38 degrees. The exact slope where the wheelchair would tip easily. Her husband's paralyzed body tumbling onto the damp forest floor like a discarded doll. Frank's eyes, the only part of him still capable of expression, locked with hers, not with hatred but with a terrible understanding. "You've been a burden long enough," Martha whispered, her wedding ring catching the fading sunlight as she brushed leaves from her hands. "This is better for both of us." Greg Thompson would later tell investigators her voice at church the next morning was steady as stone when she announced Frank had passed peacefully in his sleep. But in the gathering darkness of the Montana wilderness, Frank Miller lay helpless as the first howl echoed through the trees. She had calculated everything, except for the wolf. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Clearwater, Montana was the kind of town that appeared as a brief interruption of wilderness on highway maps. Population 187 according to the weathered sign that had needed updating since the Johnsons moved away last spring. Nestled between the sprawling Blackfoot National Forest and the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range, it was a place where neighbors still brought casseroles during hard times and nobody locked their doors at night. Frank Miller had been a fixture in Clearwater for over 40 years. At 72, his weathered hands had built half the cabins in the county, including the modest timber home he shared with Martha at the end of Whispering Pine Road. His reputation as the finest carpenter and most ethical hunter in 3 counties had earned him quiet respect, even from those who found his taciturn nature intimidating. Frank had always been a man of few words and deliberate actions, until the stroke stole even that choice from him 18 months ago. The massive cerebral hemorrhage had transformed Frank overnight from a self-reliant pillar of the community to a shell of a man trapped in a body that refused to obey the simplest commands. His mind remained sharp as ever behind eyes that now served as his only means of communication, watching helplessly as his dignity eroded with each adult diaper change and spoon-feeding. Martha Miller had once been known for her cherry pies at church socials and her quiet devotion to her husband. At 68, with silver-streaked hair and hands gnarled from arthritis, she'd taken on the role of full-time caregiver with the same silent determination she'd applied to everything in life. But the financial ruin of American healthcare had drained their savings of $247,000, and the emotional toll had hollowed her from the inside. The death of their only daughter, Emma, 15 years earlier, had cracked her spirit. Frank's condition had shattered it completely. Unknown to the townspeople, the lonely cabin in the woods had become a pressure cooker of grief, exhaustion, and resentment. Martha's eyes had grown as cold as Montana winters as she changed soiled sheets and mixed pureed meals, whispering questions that haunted her. Why didn't God take you instead of her? Frank could only answer with blinking eyes and silent tears. Greg Thompson lived half a mile down the dirt road, close enough to check on his old friend regularly. At 65, the retired sheriff still carried himself with the straight-backed dignity of law enforcement, though his once brown hair had faded to the same gray as his eyes. He alone sensed the dangerous undercurrent beneath Martha's increasingly brittle composure. But even he couldn't have predicted how far desperation would push her. Meanwhile, deep in the Blackfoot forest, a solitary figure moved like a shadow through the underbrush. The locals called him Gray, a massive wolf with silver-streaked fur and a distinctive limp from an old injury. Once the alpha of a thriving pack, he now hunted alone, avoiding both humans and other wolves with equal determination. The old trap wound on his left hind leg had healed years ago, but the wariness it instilled remained. Like Frank, Gray was a survivor whose life had been irrevocably altered by human intervention, a connection neither yet knew existed. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Martha Miller woke before dawn, her back aching from another night spent on the living room couch. The bedroom had become a makeshift hospital ward, with its medical equipment, the persistent smell of antiseptic, and the man who had once been her husband but was now a silent burden requiring constant attention. She lay there, listening to the rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator, a sound that had become the metronome of her nightmare. She shuffled to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, finding it nearly empty except for Frank's prescribed nutrition supplements. The Social Security check wouldn't arrive for another week. The mortgage payment was already 2 months behind. The final notice from Montana Healthcare Services sat unopened on the counter, another denial for home health aid assistance. Mrs. Miller, Dr. Pearson had told her last month, his voice gentle but firm. I want to be honest with you. Frank's condition isn't going to improve significantly. He'll need round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. The rest of his life. The words had hung in the air like a prison sentence. How many more years? 5? 10? The thought made her hands shake as she poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee. Martha moved to the bedroom doorway and watched Frank's chest rise and fall. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. Those eyes, still so alert, still so much Frank behind them, were almost worse than if he'd been completely unaware. They followed her around the room, pleading, thanking, questioning, sometimes accusing. They saw everything, her exhaustion, her resentment, her growing desperation. The plan had formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on a pond. At first it was just a fleeting thought during particularly difficult moments, when she'd strained her back lifting him, or when she'd found herself sobbing on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. after changing soiled bed sheets for the second time that night. Then it became a more concrete idea, one she'd push away only to have it return stronger. By the time she'd actually begun working out the logistics, Martha had stopped thinking of it as murder. It was mercy for both of them. She knew Frank's favorite part of the forest from the hunting stories he used to tell. A remote clearing near Eagle Creek, where the old-growth trees created a cathedral-like canopy. It was beautiful, peaceful, far from any hiking trails or roads, a place where nature could take its course quickly. She told herself it was more dignified than watching him waste away, imprisoned in his failing body. "We're going for a drive today, Frank," she announced, her voice unnaturally bright as she began the morning routine, cleaning, changing, dressing him in his warmest flannel shirt. "A little fresh air will do us both good." Frank's eyes widened slightly. Was it hope she saw there? Or suspicion? Martha looked away as she maneuvered him into the wheelchair. She couldn't bear to see the trust there, not today. Loading him into the old pickup was always difficult, but adrenaline made the task easier. She secured the wheelchair in the truck bed, covered Frank with a tarp to keep the wind off, and began the drive toward the national forest. The winding mountain road was empty, the tourist season long over and the locals busy with pre-winter preparations. Frank could see only slivers of landscape from beneath the tarp, but he knew these roads by heart. When Martha turned onto the unmaintained fire road, bumping along the rutted path into the deeper forest, a cold dread settled in his stomach. This wasn't their usual route to town or the clinic. His eyes darted frantically, trying to catch Martha's attention in the rearview mirror, but she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead. After nearly an hour of increasingly rough terrain, Martha stopped the truck at the edge of an old logging clearing. The silence when she cut the engine was absolute. No distant traffic, no voices, nothing but the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of a jay. She unloaded the wheelchair with mechanical efficiency, positioning Frank at the edge of a game trail that disappeared into the dense forest. His eyes asked the questions his voice couldn't, but Martha avoided his gaze as she began pushing the chair along the narrow path. "You always loved it out here," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Remember when we used to bring Emma camping? How she'd always find those little orange salamanders under the logs?" Frank's chest tightened at the mention of their daughter. Something was terribly wrong. Martha never spoke of Emma anymore. It had become an unspoken rule between them since the accident. The trail grew steeper, forcing Martha to strain against the wheelchair's weight. Frank could feel her breathing become labored, her pushes more aggressive. They continued deeper into the forest until they reached the clearing Frank recognized from countless hunting trips. Ancient pines surrounded a small grassy meadow dappled with autumn sunlight. Martha stopped the chair in the center of the clearing. For a long moment she just stood there, hands still gripping the handles, breath coming in ragged gasps that weren't entirely from exertion. "I can't do it anymore, Frank," she finally said, her voice breaking. "The money's gone. The house will be next." "There's nothing left." Frank blinked rapidly, trying desperately to communicate, to connect with the woman he'd loved for 47 years. If he could just speak, he could tell her they would find a way. They always had. They said there's a 10-month waiting list for the care facility in Missoula. 10 months. And even then, it would take everything we have left and more. Martha moved around to face him, kneeling to meet his eyes. "I'm tired, Frank. So goddamn tired." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her eyes had a frightening emptiness. Frank had seen that look before, on the faces of wounded animals when they'd given up fighting. His heart raced as understanding dawned. "You were always good to me," she whispered, touching his cheek with surprising tenderness. "Better than I deserved. Maybe that's why I hate you so much now." With sudden violence that belied her age, Martha tilted the wheelchair sideways. Frank tumbled out, landing hard on his side, face pressed against the cold earth and rotting leaves. Pain shot through his immobile body, but no sound escaped his lips. He could only lie there watching as Martha righted the empty wheelchair. "The wolves or the cold will make it quick," she said, not looking at him as she brushed dirt from her hands. "It's better than wasting away in some facility with strangers changing your diapers, more dignified." Frank's eyes pleaded, the only communication he had left. Martha finally met his gaze one last time. "Don't look at me like that. You think I want this? You think I haven't tried everything? The system failed us, Frank. Everyone failed us." She turned and began pushing the empty wheelchair back toward the trail. "Goodbye, Frank. I'll tell everyone you went peacefully in your sleep. They'll believe me. They always do." And then she was gone, the squeak of the wheelchair wheels fading into the forest sounds. Frank lay motionless as shadows lengthened across the clearing. His mind raced even as his body betrayed him. Anger, fear, and a strange sense of acceptance washed over him in waves. After all they'd been through together, after all the promises of in sickness and in health, it had come to this. Abandoned like unwanted garbage in the wilderness. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Frank's flannel shirt and light jacket were no match for the Montana autumn night. Already his extremities were growing numb, a small mercy perhaps, as it dulled the pain of his awkward position. His thoughts turned to Emma. Would he see her soon? The daughter whose smile had lit up their lives for 23 years before the accident claimed her. The thought brought unexpected peace. Maybe Martha was right about one thing. This end had a certain dignity that a sterile hospital room lacked. As darkness fell completely, the forest came alive with night sounds, and the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, and then a sound that sent primal fear coursing through Frank's veins, the long, mournful howl of a wolf. Not just any wolf call, but one he recognized from years of hunting these mountains. the distinctive timbre of the alpha male locals called Gray, named for the unusual silver streaks in his dark coat. Frank had encountered him from a distance many times over the years, had even had him in his rifle sights once, but couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. There was something too intelligent, too dignified about the creature. The howl came again, closer this time. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. The irony wasn't lost on him. A lifetime respecting these magnificent predators, only to become prey himself. A soft crackling of leaves announced the wolf's arrival before Frank saw him. Then a massive shape emerged at the edge of the clearing, silver fur gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The wolf stood perfectly still, yellow eyes fixed on the helpless man lying in the middle of the meadow. Frank held the wolf's gaze, a strange calm settling over him. If this was to be his end, at least it would be quick. At least it would be natural. The great circle of life completing itself. Gray approached cautiously, each step deliberate. Frank could smell the wild, musky scent of the predator as it came within feet of him. The wolf circled once, twice, sniffing the air, assessing. Frank waited for the killing lunge, the sharp teeth at his throat. Instead, the wolf drew nearer and looked directly into Frank's eyes. There was something in that gaze, something beyond animal instinct, recognition, curiosity. Frank couldn't name it, but in that moment, a connection formed between predator and prey that defied natural law. After what seemed an eternity, Gray did the unthinkable. The massive wolf settled onto the ground beside Frank, pressing his warm fur against the man's increasingly cold body. He positioned himself as a barrier between Frank and the biting wind, his head alert, ears swiveling to monitor the forest sounds. Frank felt the wolf's steady heartbeat against his back, the warmth gradually seeping into his chilled limbs. Confusion gave way to wonder, and wonder to profound gratitude. For reasons beyond human understanding, this wild creature had chosen to protect rather than devour. As the long night descended fully upon the Montana wilderness, man and wolf lay together, both outcasts, both survivors, both defying the cruel odds of a world that had abandoned them. Dawn broke over the Montana wilderness with the gentle persistence of a whisper. Pale light filtered through the pine canopy, illuminating the unlikely pair in the forest clearing, a paralyzed man and a massive wolf still lying side by side. Frank awakened from fitful half-sleep, momentarily disoriented, until the harsh reality of his situation crashed back. He was still alive, having survived the night against all odds. The wolf, Gray, was already awake, amber eyes alert as he surveyed their surroundings. When he sensed Frank's consciousness returning, he rose to his feet in a fluid motion, stretching his powerful body before padding a few steps away. Frank felt the absence of the animal's warmth immediately. The morning chill quickly reclaiming his immobile limbs. Gray stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back at Frank with what seemed like expectation. Then, with deliberate movements, he approached a patch of dewy grass and began to lap at the moisture. He repeated this several times before returning to Frank, nudging the man's face with his damp muzzle. Frank understood the message with startling clarity. Water. His parched throat burned with thirst, his lips already cracked and bleeding. But the morning dew was insufficient, and he couldn't move to reach it anyway. Gray seemed to comprehend the problem. The wolf paced around Frank, sniffing and assessing, before gently grabbing the collar of Frank's flannel shirt between his teeth and tugging. The movement sent jolts of pain through Frank's stiff body, but he understood the intent. Gray was trying to move him. After several unsuccessful attempts, the wolf changed tactics. He began digging at the earth beside Frank, creating a shallow depression, then disappeared into the forest. Frank lay helpless, wondering if the wolf had abandoned him after all. When Gray returned minutes later, the wolf's fur was damp around his chest and muzzle. He approached the depression he'd dug and allowed water to drip from his fur into the small hole, creating a tiny pool. With careful precision, Gray then positioned himself behind Frank and used his massive head to nudge and push the man's upper body until Frank's face was positioned directly over the small puddle. The effort was excruciating for Frank, but the reward was immediate. His lips touched moisture. Using what little muscle control remained in his neck, he managed to slurp some of the life-giving water. Gray repeated this extraordinary process several times, disappearing to soak his fur in what Frank assumed must be a nearby stream, then returning to replenish the makeshift drinking hole. Each time, Frank managed to take in a little more water, feeling strength gradually returning to his parched body. As the morning progressed, Gray's attention turned to Frank's hunger. The wolf disappeared again, this time for longer. When he returned, something small and dark hung from his jaws. He dropped his offering beside Frank's head, wild huckleberries. Using his nose, Gray rolled some of the berries directly against Frank's lips. The tart sweetness exploded in Frank's mouth as he managed to maneuver the berries with his tongue. The simple act of eating, of tasting something so vibrantly alive, brought tears to his eyes. He had been prepared to die, had almost welcomed it, but now found himself desperately wanting to live. Throughout that first full day in the wilderness, Gray established a routine of providing water and foraged food. The wolf seemed to innately understand Frank's helplessness, adapting his own behaviors to accommodate the man's needs. For a wild predator to show such apparent compassion defied everything Frank thought he knew about nature. As afternoon waned toward evening, Frank's thoughts turned to Martha. She would be back in Clearwater by now. What story had she told? Did anyone suspect? He pictured her moving through their home, perhaps already disposing of his personal belongings, rehearsing her widow's grief. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain. Yet, strangely, Frank found no hatred in his heart. Instead, he remembered the Martha he'd fallen in love with, the young woman with chestnut hair who laughed easily and dreamed of traveling the world. He remembered how she'd nursed their daughter through childhood illnesses with tender devotion, how she'd held his hand at Emma's funeral, both of them shattered beyond words. When had that Martha disappeared? Had she been eroding slowly all these years, or had his stroke been the final blow to her spirit? These thoughts occupied Frank as the day's light faded, and Gray once again settled beside him for warmth during the coming night. Despite the wolf's care, Frank knew his situation remained dire. Without proper shelter, food, and medical attention, he wouldn't survive many more days. The pressure sores were already forming where his body pressed against the unyielding ground, and his muscles screamed from being held in the same position for too long. Meanwhile, in Clearwater, Martha Miller pulled into her driveway as darkness fell. The empty wheelchair folded in the truck bed seemed to accuse her with its hollow seat and lifeless wheels. She unloaded it mechanically, wiping away dirt and leaves before storing it in the garden shed behind the house. Every movement felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from a distance. Inside the silent house, Martha moved through the familiar rooms with the strange sensation of being a visitor in her own life. The hospital bed in the living room, the medications arranged on the side table, the adult diapers stacked discreetly in the bathroom cabinet, all evidence of a life that had become unbearable. She should feel relief, she thought. Instead, she felt nothing at all, a numbness that seemed to extend from her core to her fingertips. She rehearsed what she would say tomorrow, how she would make the necessary calls. Frank passed peacefully in his sleep. Simple. Believable. No one would question it given his condition. The doctor had been expecting it. The funeral home would be discreet. No autopsy for an elderly stroke victim whose death surprised no one. Martha poured herself a generous glass of whiskey, Frank's whiskey, the bottle he'd saved for special occasions, and carried it to the porch swing where they used to watch summer sunsets together. The night air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound sent an unexpected chill down Martha's spine. The following morning, Greg Thompson was splitting firewood in his yard when he saw Martha's truck heading toward town. Something about her rigid posture behind the wheel caught his attention. In small towns, people developed a sixth sense about their neighbors, and something felt off. Greg had been meaning to check on Frank for days now. As he stacked the last of the wood, he decided to walk over after lunch. The Miller place was just a half-mile down the dirt road, an easy stroll on a crisp autumn day. He grabbed a jar of Eleanor's blackberry jam as a pretext. Frank had always had a sweet tooth. When he arrived, the house was quiet in a way that immediately put Greg's law enforcement instincts on alert, not just peaceful but abandoned feeling. He knocked firmly on the front door. No answer. He tried again, calling out, "Frank? Martha? It's Greg." After a third attempt, he tested the handle. Unlocked, as most doors in Clearwater remained. The living room struck him immediately. The hospital bed was stripped bare, the medical equipment tidied away. No sign of Frank. "Martha?" Greg called again, moving cautiously through the house. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place, yet everything felt wrong. In the kitchen, a coffee mug sat half full on the counter, lipstick on the rim. Martha's purse was gone, suggesting she'd left in a hurry. Greg checked the bedroom, bathroom, even glanced in closets. No sign of Frank anywhere. A cold knot formed in his stomach as he stepped back outside and walked around to the shed. The doors were unlocked. Inside, Frank's wheelchair sat clean and empty, tucked against the wall. Something was very wrong. Greg had spent 30 years as sheriff before retiring, and his instincts rarely misled him. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed Martha's number. It went straight to voicemail. His next call was to the current sheriff, Bill Hudson. "Bill, it's Greg Thompson. I'm at Frank Miller's place and something doesn't add up." "Frank's nowhere to be found, medical equipment's all packed up, and Martha's not answering her phone." "Maybe they went to that specialist in Missoula," Bill suggested. "With no wheelchair and the bed stripped bare? Doesn't feel right, Bill." There was a pause on the line. "You think something happened to Frank?" Greg stared at the empty wheelchair. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." As Greg ended the call, his eye caught something tucked beneath the wheelchair's seat, the edge of a leather-bound book, Frank's hunting journal. Greg had given it to him for his 60th birthday, and Frank had meticulously recorded every hunting trip for the past 12 years. Greg pulled it out, flipping through the familiar pages filled with Frank's neat handwriting, detailed maps, and observations about wildlife patterns. The most recent entries documented Frank's last hunting season before his stroke, detailed descriptions of deer movements, turkey sightings, and one particular wolf that Frank had encountered repeatedly. "Gray makes his territory along Eagle Creek again this year," Frank had written. "Magnificent specimen, at least 120 pounds, with distinctive silver streaking through his coat. Had him in my sights today, but couldn't pull the trigger. Something too intelligent in those eyes. Some creatures deserve their freedom." Greg stared at the entry, a terrible suspicion forming. Martha couldn't have physically carried Frank away herself, but she could have driven him somewhere remote. Somewhere like Eagle Creek, deep in the national forest, where nature would take its course. "Jesus Christ," Greg whispered to the empty shed. His suspicion crystallized into certainty when he returned to the house and discovered Frank's warmest hunting jacket missing from its hook by the door. Martha would have dressed him for the outdoors, for exposure. Greg was halfway to his truck when he nearly collided with Martha coming up the walk. Her face was composed, eyes red-rimmed but dry. She carried a paper bag from Clearwater's only pharmacy. "Greg," she said, surprise briefly flickering across her features before her expression settled into something carefully neutral. "What brings you by?" "Looking for Frank," Greg replied, watching her reaction closely. "Haven't seen him in a while." Martha's pause was almost imperceptible. "Oh, Greg, I was just about to call you." Her voice dropped to a practiced hush. "Frank passed away last night, in his sleep. Very peaceful." The lie hung in the air between them. Greg had known Martha for over 30 years, had watched her raise Emma alongside his own children, had stood beside her at Emma's funeral. Now he looked at her and saw a stranger. "That's so," he said carefully. "I'm mighty sorry to hear it, Martha." "When's the service?" "No service," she replied too quickly. "Frank never wanted a fuss. I'll have him cremated. Private, you know." Greg nodded slowly. "I understand. Where is he now?" Another slight hesitation. "Missoula, the funeral home there. They took him early this morning." "Which one?" "I'd like to pay my respects." Martha's facade cracked slightly. "I don't remember the name. It's all been such a blur." "I bet," Greg said, his voice gentle despite the anger building inside him. "Well, I should let you rest. You've had a hard day." As he turned to leave, Martha called after him. "He wasn't suffering anymore, Greg. That's what matters." Greg paused, but didn't turn around. "You're right about that, Martha. No one should suffer." He walked to his truck, each step heavy with the weight of what he'd learned. Once inside, he pulled out his phone again, this time calling Bill Hudson with a different urgency in his voice. "Bill, I need search and rescue at Eagle Creek." Now, the second day in the wilderness brought new challenges for Frank. Though Gray had provided water and some sustenance, Frank's body was beginning to rebel against the prolonged immobility and exposure. Pressure sores formed where his hip and shoulder pressed against the ground, sending shooting pain through his nervous system. The morning dew had soaked through his clothing, leaving him damp and chilled despite the weak autumn sunlight filtering through the trees. Gray seemed to sense Frank's deteriorating condition. The wolf paced anxiously around the clearing, occasionally disappearing into the forest, only to return minutes later, as if checking the perimeter. By midday, the animal had settled into a routine, bringing water, foraging for berries, and lying beside Frank to share body heat. With each interaction, the bond between them deepened beyond explanation. Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, his thoughts swimming between present discomfort and memories of his life before. He remembered his father teaching him to hunt in these very woods, showing him how to read animal tracks and respect the balance of nature. He thought of the day he'd met Martha at the county fair, her chestnut hair gleaming in the summer sun as she laughed at his awkward attempts at flirtation. He recalled the indescribable joy of holding newborn Emma, so tiny and perfect, her entire hand wrapping around his single finger. These memories sustained him through the pain, providing a mental escape when physical relief was impossible. During brief moments of clarity, Frank found himself studying Gray with newfound appreciation. The wolf moved with purpose and intelligence, his actions seemingly calculated to maximize Frank's comfort and chances for survival. When Frank shivered, Gray pressed closer. When Frank's lips cracked from dehydration, Gray brought more water. As evening approached on the second day, Frank noticed Gray becoming increasingly alert. His ears perked forward, muscles tensing beneath silver-streaked fur. A low growl rumbled in the wolf's throat as he positioned himself protectively in front of Frank, facing the eastern edge of the clearing. Frank strained to hear what had triggered the wolf's response, but his human senses detected nothing unusual in the forest sounds. Then he felt it, a subtle vibration in the ground beneath him. Something large was moving through the underbrush, coming closer. Gray's growl intensified, hackles rising along his powerful spine. Frank's heart raced with primal fear, his paralyzed body utterly defenseless against whatever approached. The creature that emerged from the tree line was a massive brown bear, its fur catching the late afternoon sunlight as it lumbered into the clearing. Frank immediately recognized it as one of the grizzlies that occasionally ventured down from the higher elevations in search of food before hibernation. The bear paused, small eyes glittering with intelligence as it surveyed the unusual scene before it, a prone human and a wolf standing guard. Gray stood his ground, body tense as a coiled spring. Though the wolf was formidable, he was dramatically outmatched by the bear's sheer size and strength. Frank wanted to call out, to somehow warn Gray away from what would surely be a fatal confrontation, but his useless vocal cords produced no sound. He could only watch in helpless terror as nature's brutal hierarchy asserted itself. The bear rose onto its hind legs, towering at nearly 8 feet tall, and released a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very air. Gray responded with a snarl that displayed impressive canines, but the size disparity between the two predators made the confrontation seem almost absurd. It was David facing Goliath without a slingshot. When the bear dropped to all fours and charged, Frank closed his eyes, unable to watch Gray's certain demise. But instead of the sounds of combat, he heard the swift movement of paws on earth, followed by another, challenging growl, this time from behind him. He opened his eyes to see Gray executing a strategic retreat, drawing the bear away from Frank's vulnerable position while maintaining an aggressive posture. What followed was an extraordinary display of cunning over power. Gray darted in and out of the bear's reach, nipping at its flanks before retreating, leading the frustrated predator in circles around the clearing, but always keeping himself between the bear and Frank. The wolf was using intelligence to compensate for his physical disadvantage, employing tactics that spoke of experience and calculation beyond mere animal instinct. The standoff continued for what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes. The bear, despite its superior strength, grew increasingly frustrated by its inability to land a decisive blow against the agile wolf. Gray, though clearly tiring, refused to yield ground that would expose Frank to danger. The dance of predators reached its crescendo when Gray executed a lightning-fast lunge at the bear's face, teeth grazing the sensitive nose before leaping away. The bear reared back, pawing at its injured snout and bellowing in pain and rage. Gray pressed his advantage, harassing the bear with strategic strikes until, remarkably, the massive creature seemed to reconsider the effort required for this unusual prey. With a final disgusted huff, the grizzly turned and ambled back toward the forest edge, occasionally glancing back as if reassessing its decision. Gray maintained his defensive position until the bear disappeared completely into the underbrush, the sound of its heavy footfalls fading into the distance. Only then did the wolf relax his posture, though his vigilant eyes continued to scan the tree line. He returned to Frank's side, breathing heavily from exertion, a small cut visible where the bear's claw had grazed his shoulder. Frank felt a swell of emotion that transcended gratitude. This wild creature had risked its life to protect him, a human, traditionally the wolf's enemy. The significance of this act struck Frank with the force of revelation. In his weakest moment, abandoned by his own kind, he had found unexpected salvation in the compassion of a predator. As darkness fell once more, Gray settled beside Frank with a heavy sigh, his warm body providing comfort against the deepening chill. Frank wished desperately for the ability to stroke the wolf's fur, to somehow communicate his profound appreciation. Instead, He could only blink back tears as Gray rested his massive head on his paws, yellow eyes maintaining their protective watch over the clearing. That night, as stars emerged in the clear Montana sky, Frank found himself contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought him here. For 40 years, he had considered himself a master of these woods, a hunter who understood the wilderness and its inhabitants. Now, helpless and humbled, he was receiving a profound education in the complexity of wild creatures and their capacity for behaviors that defied human categorization. Meanwhile, in Clearwater, Greg Thompson was assembling a search party with grim determination. Sheriff Bill Hudson had initially been skeptical of Greg's suspicions. Martha Miller was a respected member of the community, not someone who would abandon her ailing husband in the wilderness. But Greg's insistence, coupled with the discovery of Frank's hunting journal and Martha's contradictory statements about Frank's whereabouts, had convinced Bill to authorize a search operation. "We're looking for a 72-year-old man paralyzed from a stroke," Greg explained to the 5 volunteers gathered in Bill's office that evening. "He's likely wearing a blue flannel shirt and his old hunting jacket. Based on his journal, I believe Martha took him to the Eagle Creek area, probably near the old clearing where Frank used to set up his hunting blind." "You really think she left him out there to die?" asked Mike Lawson, the owner of Clearwater's general store. "Martha? Who brings casseroles to every funeral?" "People break," Greg replied simply. 18 months of round-the-clock care, no support, no money left. I'm not excusing it, but I understand it. If he's been out there for 2 days already..." Bill left the implication hanging in the air. "Then we need to move fast," Greg finished. "The forecast shows temperatures dropping tomorrow. If we don't find him tonight, we'll have the state police helicopter join the search at first light." The men nodded solemnly, gathering their gear: flashlights, first aid kits, emergency blankets, radios. Each privately contemplated the grim likelihood that they were searching not for a man, but for a body. Even in the mild autumn weather, a paralyzed man exposed to the elements would not survive long. As the search party loaded into their vehicles, Martha Miller sat alone in her kitchen, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table before her. The initial numbness had worn off, leaving behind a crushing weight of reality. She had abandoned her husband, the man she had once loved beyond reason, the father of her child, to die alone in the wilderness. "What have I done?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking on the question. The house seemed to accuse her with its silence, every corner holding memories of the life they had built together. The mantel with Frank's carpentry awards, the height marks on the kitchen door frame tracking Emma's growth, the rocking chair Frank had crafted when Martha was pregnant, its arms worn smooth from years of use. She had told herself it was mercy, told herself Frank would understand. But in the stark reality of her empty home, those justifications rang hollow. She poured another drink with trembling hands, seeking oblivion from the truth that was becoming increasingly clear. She hadn't done this for Frank. She had done it for herself. The telephone rang, startling Martha from her dark thoughts. She stared at it, heart pounding, wondering if someone had discovered her secret already. After 4 rings, it went to the answering machine. Bill Hudson's voice filled the kitchen. "Martha, it's Sheriff Hudson. I need you to call me as soon as you get this message. It's about Frank." Martha's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the linoleum floor. They knew. Somehow, they knew. The walls of her carefully constructed deception were crumbling around her. She stumbled to the sink, gripping its edge as nausea overwhelmed her. What would happen now? Would they arrest her? Would the whole town know what she had done? The shame was unbearable. Martha had always prided herself on being the dutiful wife, the good Christian, the pillar of the community who never complained despite life's hardships. Now she would be the monster who abandoned her helpless husband if he was found. A small, terrible part of her hoped he wouldn't be, that nature would complete what she had started, erasing the evidence of her crime. The thought sickened her even as it formed. What kind of person had she become? When had the loving wife transformed into this desperate, broken woman capable of such cruelty? Martha sank to the floor amid the broken glass, no longer able to hold back the sobs that tore from her throat. Back in the forest, unaware of the search being organized on his behalf, Frank drifted in and out of consciousness. His condition was deteriorating rapidly, dehydration, exposure, and immobility taking their cumulative toll. Even with Gray's extraordinary efforts, a human body had limits that were quickly being reached. As moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting silver patterns across the clearing, Frank found his thoughts turning to acceptance. He had lived a good life, had known love and purpose. If this was to be his end, there was a certain peace in returning to the earth in this place that had always felt like a spiritual home to him, and he was not alone. The wolf's steady presence beside him offered a strange comfort that transcended the boundaries between species. Gray seemed to sense Frank's fading strength. The wolf positioned himself even closer, his massive head resting gently against Frank's chest as if listening to his heartbeat. In those quiet hours, a communication beyond words passed between man and wolf, a recognition of kinship that defied explanation but felt as real as the ground beneath them. Frank's last conscious thought before drifting into fitful sleep was not of Martha's betrayal or his own suffering, but of gratitude for this wild creature who had shown him the true meaning of loyalty in his final hours. While Frank slept in the forest clearing, the search party had begun their methodical sweep of the Eagle Creek area. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness as the men called Frank's name, their voices echoing unanswered through the vast wilderness. The forest kept its secrets close, revealing nothing of the extraordinary bond forming between a dying man and a solitary wolf in a clearing still beyond their reach. In Clearwater, lights burned late in the sheriff's office as additional volunteers arrived, maps were studied, and search grids established. The community that had failed to notice Martha's desperate struggle was now rallying to find the man she had abandoned. The irony was lost on no one, least of all Greg Thompson, who had seen the warning signs but failed to act in time. "We'll find him," Greg promised Bill as they coordinated the expanding search effort. "Dead or alive, we'll bring Frank home." What none of them could have anticipated was that home for Frank Miller had been redefined in the past 48 hours. It was no longer the cabin at the end of Whispering Pine Road, but a clearing in the wilderness where an unlikely guardian kept watch through the long, cold night. As dawn approached on the third day, the fates of all involved, Frank, Gray, Martha, and the searchers, converged toward a reckoning that would forever change their understanding of loyalty, betrayal, and the complex bonds that define humanity in its brightest and darkest moments. The third morning dawned with an ominous gray sky that promised rain. Frank Miller opened his eyes to find himself alone in the clearing. Gray was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through his immobile body, a visceral fear of abandonment that felt both familiar and freshly painful. Had the wolf finally moved on, returning to the natural order that dictated predator and prey? Frank couldn't blame him if he had. Even in the animal kingdom there was no sense in guarding dying prey. A soft rustling from the forest edge drew Frank's attention. Gray emerged from the underbrush, his muzzle damp with morning dew. The relief that flooded through Frank was overwhelming, bringing unexpected tears to his eyes. The wolf approached with his now familiar, purposeful gait and dropped something beside Frank's head, a cluster of wild cranberries, tart but edible. Using his nose, Gray nudged several of the berries against Frank's lips. Frank managed to take the offering, the sharp taste exploding on his tongue, but swallowing had become increasingly difficult. his throat parched despite Gray's water-carrying efforts. The wolf seemed to sense this struggle, his intelligent eyes studying Frank with what could only be described as concern. Gray disappeared again, returning shortly with his fur dripping from another visit to the nearby stream. The day progressed with Gray's continued ministrations, but Frank was acutely aware that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The pressure sores where his body contacted the ground had become excruciating, infections setting in where the skin had broken. His breathing grew increasingly labored, each inhalation a conscious effort against the weight of his own chest. Without medication, without movement, without proper hydration, his body was shutting down system by system. In these hours that he now accepted might be his last, Frank found his thoughts turning not to regret or anger, but to a strange sense of wonder. How extraordinary that in his final days he had witnessed something science would struggle to explain, a wild predator choosing compassion over instinct. If he could have spoken, Frank would have told Gray that this gift of unexpected kindness had made his last days more meaningful than years of healthier existence. A light rain began to fall around midday, pattering gently on the forest floor and dampening Frank's clothes. Gray immediately positioned himself to shelter Frank's face, his own thick fur taking the brunt of the increasing downpour. Water dripped from the wolf's coat onto Frank's forehead, running into his eyes and blurring his vision. Through this watery veil, Frank watched the darkening sky and wondered if he would survive another night. The fever that had been building since the previous evening now raged through his system, bringing with it vivid hallucinations that blended past and present. In one moment, Frank was young again, carrying little Emma on his shoulders through this very forest, pointing out deer tracks and bird songs. In the next, he was arguing with Martha about money, about the cost of Emma's college tuition, about whether they could afford the insurance premiums that had doubled that year. Most haunting were the visions of the accident, the rainy night, the headlights reflecting off wet asphalt, Emma's laughter suddenly silenced by the sickening crunch of metal. These memories, partially suppressed for 15 years, now played in vivid detail behind his feverish eyes. Martha behind the wheel, eyes glazed from too many glasses of wine at their anniversary dinner. Frank reaching for the steering wheel too late. Emma in the back seat, not wearing her seatbelt. The truth that Frank had buried beneath years of protective love crashed through his delirium. Martha had been driving. Martha had been intoxicated. But it was Frank who told the responding officers he had been behind the wheel. Frank who accepted the burden of guilt, the community's whispered judgments, the weight of their daughter's death. He had done it to protect Martha from jail, from public shame, from a burden he knew would destroy her completely. What he couldn't have anticipated was how this inverted truth would slowly poison their marriage from within. Martha's guilt transformed into resentment, toward Frank for his sacrifice, toward herself for accepting it, toward the universe for taking their only child. The stroke that paralyzed Frank had merely accelerated a moral deterioration that began the night they buried their daughter, and the truth along with her. As the rain intensified, Frank's fever dreams swirled into darkness. Gray remained steadfast beside him, occasionally licking the rainwater from Frank's face in what seemed like an attempt to cool his burning skin. The wolf's yellow eyes were the last thing Frank saw before consciousness slipped away entirely, his body surrendering to the infection that now raced through his bloodstream. While Frank's life hung by an increasingly frayed thread, the search party had regrouped at dawn, their numbers swelled by additional volunteers from neighboring communities. Greg Thompson stood at the hood of Sheriff Hudson's truck, pointing to locations on a map spread between them. "We covered these quadrants yesterday," he explained, indicating the areas already searched. "Today we push further in, focusing on this area around Upper Eagle Creek. Frank's journal mentioned a clearing where he used to set up his blind. That's our best bet." The men nodded grimly, understanding the urgency. The weather forecast predicted deteriorating conditions throughout the day, with temperatures dropping significantly overnight. "If he's still alive, we need to find him before nightfall," Bill Hudson said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Otherwise," the unfinished sentence hung in the damp morning air. Greg zipped his jacket against the chill and addressed the assembled group. "We're looking for a paralyzed man who can't call out for help. Check every clearing, every ravine. Frank knows these woods better than anyone. If he could have found shelter, he would have." "What about Martha?" asked Mike Lawson. "Any word from her?" Sheriff Hudson's expression hardened. "She's not answering her door or her phone. I've got Deputy Roberts keeping an eye on the house to make sure she doesn't try to leave town." "Are we filing charges?" someone asked. "Let's find Frank first," Bill replied. "Then we'll deal with Martha." The search party divided into teams of 3, each assigned a specific area to cover. Greg partnered with 2 experienced hunters who had often accompanied Frank on expeditions before his stroke. They took the most remote section, the area furthest from the road where Frank had recorded encounters with the wolf he called Gray. As they hiked deeper into the forest, the rain began to fall in earnest, reducing visibility and turning the forest floor into treacherous mud. Every step became a calculated effort, but Greg pushed forward with single-minded determination. His friendship with Frank spanned 5 decades. He would not abandon him now, would not allow Frank's story to end in this cruel isolation. "You really think he could still be alive out here?" asked Tom Baker, one of the hunters, as they paused to check their coordinates. "3 nights exposed, no food, can't move." "Frank's tougher than most men half his age," Greg replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "And he knows these woods like the back of his hand." "Knowing and doing are different things when you're paralyzed," the other hunter, Jim Blackwell, pointed out quietly. Greg didn't respond, simply adjusted his rain gear and pressed forward along the muddy trail. The truth was, he had little hope of finding Frank alive. This mission had transformed in his mind from rescue to recovery, bringing his friend home for a proper burial, the dignity Martha had tried to deny him. Back in Clearwater, Martha Miller sat in her parked truck outside the town's small church, rain drumming on the roof as she stared at the simple white steeple. She hadn't slept, hadn't changed clothes, hadn't done anything but drink and weep since Sheriff Hudson's call. Now, with the first gray light of morning, she had driven here without conscious decision, drawn to the only place she could imagine seeking absolution. The church was empty when she entered, droplets of rainwater falling from her coat to the worn wooden floor. Martha moved slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silent sanctuary. She slid into the front pew and stared up at the cross, words failing her completely. How did one ask forgiveness for something so monstrous? What prayer could possibly encompass the magnitude of her betrayal? "Martha, is that you?" Pastor Daniel Stevens stood in the side doorway, surprise evident on his kind face. In his late 60s, with silver hair and compassionate eyes, he had been Clearwater's spiritual leader for over 30 years. "I heard about Frank," he said gently, moving to sit beside her. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Martha's laugh was a broken, terrible sound. "My loss." "My loss?" Pastor Stevens regarded her with careful attention, noting her disheveled appearance, the smell of alcohol, the wild look in her bloodshot eyes. "Martha, what's happened?" "I killed him," she whispered, the words falling into the quiet church like stones. "I drove him into the forest and left him there to die, like garbage. My husband of 47 years. The pastor's expression shifted from concern to shock, but his voice remained steady. "Martha, are you saying Frank didn't die naturally?" "He's probably still dying right now," she replied, staring at her hands. "In the rain, alone, I can't even give him that mercy. A quick death. I'm not just a murderer. I'm a coward." Pastor Stevens took a deep breath, processing this confession. "The search parties, they're looking for him now. There's still hope, Martha." "Hope?" Her voice cracked. "What would be hopeful about finding him?" "Either he's already dead from exposure or they'll bring him back to the same hell that made me do this in the first place. No insurance, no money for care, nothing but suffering until the end. There are always options, Martha. Always help available if you reach out." "Where?" she demanded, sudden anger flaring. "Where was this help for the past 18 months? Where was it when I had to sell our belongings to pay for his medications? When I hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch for over a year? When I had to choose between buying his dietary supplements or paying the electric bill?" Her voice echoed through the empty church, years of suppressed rage and desperation finally finding release. Pastor Stevens didn't interrupt, allowing her to empty the poisonous reservoir of resentment that had led to her unthinkable act. "I loved him," Martha finally said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "God help me, I still love him." "How could I have done this?" Before Pastor Stevens could respond, the church door burst open. Deputy Robert stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat. "Pastor, Mrs. Miller, Sheriff Hudson just radioed in. They found something in the Eagle Creek area. They're requesting medical evacuation immediately." Martha's face drained of color. "Frank? They found Frank?" "I don't have details, ma'am, just that they need the helicopter from Missoula now." Pastor Stevens stood, helping Martha to her feet. "I'll drive you." "No," Deputy Robert said firmly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller, but Sheriff Hudson gave specific instructions. You're to remain in town until he returns." The implication was clear. Martha was not to be allowed near the search area, not to be given an opportunity to interfere if Frank had somehow survived her attempted murder. She sank back into the pew, the momentary hope crushed under the weight of consequences now bearing down upon her. "Go," she told Pastor Stevens. "Please, be with him when they find him. Don't let him be alone." As the pastor and deputy left, Martha remained in the empty church, her soft weeping, the only sound besides the rain pattering against stained glass windows. Outside, sirens wailed as emergency vehicles mobilized, the small town suddenly electric with activity after days of oblivious calm. Deep in the forest, the search had intensified as the weather deteriorated. Greg Thompson and his team had been methodically working their grid pattern when Jim Blackwell suddenly froze, raising his hand for silence. "You hear that?" he whispered. Greg and Tom strained to listen past the steady drumming of rain on leaves. At first, Greg heard nothing unusual, just the ambient sounds of the forest and rainfall. Then it came again, a low, mournful howl that raised the hair on the back of his neck. "Wolf," Tom confirmed unnecessarily. "Gray," Greg corrected, remembering Frank's journal descriptions. "It has to be." The howl came again, closer this time. Instead of moving away from the sound as conventional wisdom would dictate, Greg changed direction, heading straight toward it. "What are you doing?" Jim hissed. "That's a predator calling." "It's also the wolf Frank wrote about," Greg replied without slowing, "the one he could never bring himself to shoot. If Frank is, or was, out here, and that wolf found him..." He left the implication unspoken. Both hunters understood the grim reality. A paralyzed man would be easy prey for any predator. The wolf's howls might be a celebration of a successful hunt. They pushed through increasingly dense underbrush, the rain now falling in sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. Greg's heart pounded with dread and anticipation. They were close to the clearing Frank had described in his journal, the one with the ancient pine at its center, where deer often grazed in early morning mist. The underbrush suddenly gave way, and they found themselves at the edge of a small meadow. What they saw stopped them in their tracks, an image so unexpected and profound that for several seconds none of them could speak. In the center of the clearing lay Frank Miller, his still form soaked by rain, clothes mud-stained and torn. And standing over him, teeth bared in warning, was the largest wolf Greg had ever encountered. Silver-gray fur stood erect along its massive spine as it growled low in its throat, yellow eyes locked on the intruders with unmistakable intent. Protection, not predation. "My God," breathed Tom. "It's guarding him." "Is Frank?" Jim couldn't finish the question. Greg squinted through the rain. "I can't tell if he's breathing from here." The wolf's growl intensified as Greg took a tentative step forward. The animal positioned itself more firmly between the approaching humans and Frank's prone form, its message clear. "Come no closer." "Call for backup," Greg told Jim without taking his eyes off the wolf. "And get on the radio to Missoula. We need that medical chopper now." As Jim fumbled with the radio, Greg slowly removed his rain jacket, letting it fall to the ground in a deliberate motion meant to appear non-threatening. He knew from Frank's journals that Gray was exceptionally intelligent, even for a wolf. Perhaps it could be reasoned with, at least long enough to determine if Frank still lived. "Easy, boy," Greg said softly, using the same tone he'd use with a nervous dog. "We're not here to hurt him. We're friends. Friends of Frank." The wolf's ears twitched at Frank's name, but its defensive posture didn't relax. Greg took another careful step forward, then froze as the wolf's growl deepened to a snarl, displaying impressive canines. "This is insane," Tom whispered. "That thing's going to tear you apart." "He's been protecting Frank," Greg replied with certainty. "Otherwise, why not just eat him? He's deliberately kept him alive. I need to get closer, see if Frank's still breathing." "I've got Sheriff Hudson on the radio," Jim called. "Backup's coming, chopper's 20 minutes out." "Frank might not have 20 minutes, Greg said. Making a decision, he slowly knelt on the wet ground, bringing himself to the wolf's eye level. "I'm going to try something." Before his companions could protest, Greg began speaking directly to the wolf, his voice calm and steady despite the rain pelting his face. "Gray, that's what Frank calls you, isn't it? Gray. He wrote about you in his journal. Said you were the smartest wolf he'd ever encountered. Said he couldn't bring himself to shoot you, even when he had you in his sights." The wolf's growl subsided slightly, its head tilting in what appeared to be curiosity or recognition. "Frank is my friend," Greg continued. "My best friend. I need to help him now, just like you've been helping him. Please." To the astonishment of Tom and Jim, the wolf's aggressive posture gradually relaxed. It didn't move away from Frank, but the snarling stopped, replaced by an intense, evaluative stare. Greg seized the moment, moving slowly but steadily forward. The wolf watched his approach with alert attention but didn't renew its threats. When Greg was within 10 feet of Frank, he could finally see his friend clearly, and his heart sank. Frank's skin had the gray pallor of severe shock, his lips blue from cold and oxygen deprivation, his clothes were soaked through, plastered to his thin frame, but most miraculous of all, his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Frank Miller was alive. "He's breathing!" Greg called back to the others. "Get that chopper here now!" The wolf, seemingly understanding that these humans intended help rather than harm, took several steps back, though it remained vigilant, watching Greg's every move as he knelt beside Frank. "Frank, can you hear me?" Greg gently touched his friend's face, alarmed by the heat radiating from his skin despite the cold rain. "It's Greg. We found you, buddy. Help is coming." Frank's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a visible struggle. Greg quickly assessed his condition. Severe dehydration, probable pneumonia, infected pressure sores, and dangerously low body temperature despite the fever. It was a miracle he'd survived this long. "How is he?" Tom called, still keeping his distance from the wolf. "Alive, but just barely," Greg replied, removing his flannel shirt and laying it over Frank for whatever meager warmth it might provide. "We need to get him out of this rain." As if in response to his words, the wolf suddenly moved, circling around to Frank's other side. With careful deliberation, it lay down against Frank's body, providing warmth and shelter from the rain with its own massive form. The animal's eyes met Greg's across Frank's unconscious form, a moment of silent communication between two beings united by their concern for the man between them. "I'll be damned," Jim whispered, watching from the edge of the clearing. "It really has been taking care of him." The distant thrum of helicopter rotors cut through the sound of rainfall, growing steadily louder. The wolf's ears perked at the unfamiliar noise, its body tensing once more. "It's okay," Greg told the animal, uncertain if his words held any meaning but feeling compelled to offer reassurance. "That's help coming." For Frank. As the helicopter approached, more searchers arrived at the clearing, their expressions registering shock at the tableau before them. Frank lying unconscious, attended by both his oldest human friend and a massive wild predator working in improbable concert. Sheriff Hudson pushed through the gathering crowd, radio in hand. "Medevac's almost here. How's he—" He stopped abruptly, staring at the wolf. "What in God's name?" "Meet Gray," Greg said simply. "He's been keeping Frank alive." "That's a wild animal, Greg. We need to secure the area before the medical team lands." "You try to move that wolf and I guarantee it won't end well," Greg warned. "He's not aggressive unless Frank is threatened. He's been protecting him for 3 days." Bill Hudson looked skeptical, but nodded to his deputies to hold their positions. The helicopter was now visible through the rain, circling to find a landing zone in the small clearing. As the aircraft descended, the downdraft creating a momentary rain-free circle around them, the wolf finally stood. It gave Frank's face one last, gentle nudge with its muzzle, then backed away toward the forest edge, yellow eyes never leaving the scene. "Gray," Greg called impulsively. "Thank you." The wolf paused at the tree line, looking back one final time as the medical team rushed forward with a stretcher and emergency equipment. Then, like a silver ghost, it melted into the forest shadows and was gone. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing Frank as best they could before transferring him to the helicopter. Greg provided what information he could about Frank's condition and the extraordinary circumstances of his survival. "His wife abandoned him out here," he explained to the lead paramedic, raising his voice over the helicopter's idling engines. "3 days ago. Wolf's been keeping him alive." The paramedic's expression registered disbelief before professionalism took over. "He's septic from infected pressure sores, severely dehydrated, and showing signs of pneumonia. BP's dangerously low. We need to move now." "I'm coming with you," Greg insisted, already climbing aboard. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Frank toward emergency medical care in Missoula, Greg looked down at the clearing rapidly shrinking beneath them. At its edge, barely visible through the rain and trees, stood a solitary gray figure, head raised as if watching their departure. "Hang on, Frank," Greg murmured, gripping his friend's cold hand. "You've made it this far with the help of a wild wolf. Don't give up now." The helicopter banked eastward, leaving behind the wilderness that had nearly claimed Frank Miller's life, but had instead become the setting for an extraordinary demonstration of compassion that transcended species. Below, in the vast Montana forest, a lone wolf raised its voice in a mournful howl that followed the helicopter until distance finally swallowed the sound. The Mercy Hospital in Missoula was a flurry of activity as the medevac helicopter touched down on the roof landing pad. A trauma team waited, huddled against the rain, ready to receive the critical patient from the Montana wilderness. Frank Miller was rushed through sliding doors into the bright fluorescence of modern medicine, a jarring contrast to the primal forest setting where he had hovered between life and death for 3 days. Greg Thompson followed the gurney as far as he was permitted, watching helplessly as doctors and nurses swarmed around his friend, calling out vital signs and medical terminology that meant little to him but conveyed the gravity of Frank's condition. A kind-faced nurse finally intercepted Greg, steering him toward a private waiting area. "They'll do everything possible for your friend," she assured him, pressing a cup of coffee into his trembling hands. "But it's going to take some time. You should call anyone who needs to know he's been found." Greg nodded mechanically, his mind still processing the extraordinary scene in the forest clearing. The wolf standing guard. Frank's improbable survival. The strange communion between man and predator that defied rational explanation. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed Sheriff Hudson's number. "Bill, they've got him at Mercy now. It's touch and go." Greg's voice cracked with emotion and exhaustion. "What's happening there? Has anyone told Martha?" On the other end of the line, Bill Hudson stood in the doorway of his patrol car, watching Pastor Stevens emerge from the Clearwater Community Church where Martha Miller had taken refuge. "Pastor's been with her at the church. I'm about to head over there now," Bill replied. "Greg, this is a mess. If Frank pulls through, Martha could be looking at attempted murder charges. If he doesn't..." He left the grim alternative unspoken. "He survived 3 days in the wilderness with nothing but a wild wolf for protection," Greg said firmly. "Don't count Frank out yet." After ending the call, Greg sank into an uncomfortable waiting room chair, finally allowing the adrenaline to ebb from his system. The events of the past 24 hours seemed surreal. Martha's betrayal, the desperate search, and most incredibly, the wolf that had defied every natural instinct to protect a vulnerable human. If Greg hadn't witnessed it himself, he would have dismissed it as the invention of an overwrought mind. A doctor emerged from the trauma area 2 hours later, his surgical cap in hand and deep fatigue etched on his face. Dr. Aaron Michaels was in his early 50s with prematurely gray hair and the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're here for Frank Miller." Greg stood quickly. "Yes. How is he?" "Critical but stable." "Your friend is remarkably resilient for a man his age, especially considering the circumstances." Dr. Michaels gestured for Greg to sit again and took the chair beside him. "He's suffering from hypothermia, pneumonia, severe dehydration, and infected pressure sores that have developed into sepsis. We've started him on broad-spectrum antibiotics, fluids, and vasopressors to support his blood pressure." "But he'll recover?" Greg pressed, searching the doctor's face for reassurance. Dr. Michaels' expression remained carefully neutral. "It's too soon to make promises. The next 24 to 48 hours will be crucial. The infections we're dealing with are severe, and his immune system was already compromised by his stroke." "Can I see him?" "He's being moved to the ICU. Once he's settled, you can have a brief visit." The doctor hesitated, then added, "I understand from the paramedics that there are unusual circumstances surrounding how Mr. Miller came to be in the wilderness?" Greg nodded grimly. "His wife abandoned him there, left him to die." Dr. Michaels' professional composure faltered momentarily. "I see. The police will need to be involved then." "They already are. Sheriff Hudson in Clearwater is handling it." "And the paramedics mentioned something about a wolf?" The doctor's tone suggested he believed this detail to be exaggerated or misunderstood. "That part's true too," Greg confirmed. "A gray wolf protected him, brought him water, even defended him from a bear. Without that animal, Frank would have died the first night." Dr. Michaels looked skeptical, but nodded politely. "Well, whatever the circumstances, he's receiving the best care possible now." I'll have a nurse come get you when you can see him." Back in Clearwater, Sheriff Bill Hudson and Pastor Stevens sat across from Martha Miller in the church's small office. Martha's face was ashen, her hands clasped so tightly on the desk between them that her knuckles shone white against her skin. "Frank's alive?" she repeated, her voice barely audible. "After 3 days?" "Yes," Bill confirmed, his tone professionally neutral despite his personal feelings about what she had done. "He's in critical condition at Mercy Hospital in Missoula, but he's fighting." Martha closed her eyes, a complex wave of emotions crossing her face, relief, disbelief, and something darker that might have been disappointment. "How?" she whispered. "How could he possibly survive?" Pastor Stevens leaned forward. "Martha, they found Frank being protected by a wolf, a wild wolf that apparently stayed with him, brought him water, even defended him from predators. The search party witnessed it themselves." Martha's eyes snapped open, her expression shifting to disbelief. "That's impossible. Wolves don't. They wouldn't." "This one did," Bill said firmly. Greg Thompson identified it as a wolf Frank had written about in his hunting journal, called it Gray. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Gray? Frank's wolf? The one he could never bring himself to shoot?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Oh God, what have I done?" Bill cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Martha, I need to be clear about what happens next. Frank was left in the wilderness with the expectation that he would die. That constitutes attempted murder under Montana law." "I understand," she said dully. "I'm placing you under house arrest pending formal charges. You'll wear an ankle monitor and you're not to leave Clearwater. Your passport has been flagged." Bill's official tone softened slightly. "Given your age and lack of prior criminal record, I've convinced the county prosecutor to allow this instead of immediate detention, but it's conditional on your full cooperation." Martha nodded mechanically, beyond caring about legal consequences. "Can I see him, please?" "I need to tell him—" "That's not possible right now," Pastor Stevens interjected gently. "Frank is in intensive care, and even if he weren't, there's a protection order being processed. You won't be allowed contact." Martha's face crumpled, the full weight of her actions finally crashing down upon her. "What kind of monster have I become?" she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "My husband. My Frank." Bill and Pastor Stevens exchanged uncomfortable glances over her bowed head. No words could adequately address the moral abyss Martha had fallen into, or the extraordinary circumstances that had prevented her act from becoming irrevocable. At Mercy Hospital, Greg was finally allowed to see Frank in the ICU. The room was dimly lit, filled with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Frank lay still and small amid a tangle of tubes and wires, his skin almost translucent against the white hospital sheets. A ventilator breathed for him, the artificial rise and fall of his chest the only visible movement. Greg approached cautiously, shocked by his friend's transformed appearance. In just 3 days, Frank seemed to have aged a decade. His cheeks were sunken, his closed eyes deeply recessed in their sockets. But he was alive, a fact that still seemed miraculous given what he had endured. "Hey, Frank," Greg said softly, taking a seat beside the bed. "You really gave us a scare, old friend." No response came, of course. Frank was heavily sedated, his body focusing all its resources on fighting the infections raging within. Greg gently laid his hand on Frank's arm, careful to avoid the IV lines. "Your wolf buddy saved your life," he continued, feeling slightly foolish talking to an unconscious man, but needing to make the connection nonetheless. "Damnedest thing I've ever seen. Gray stood guard over you like you were his own pack. Wouldn't let us near you at first." A nurse entered quietly to check Frank's vital signs, adjusting one of the medication pumps before offering Greg a sympathetic smile. "Is there any change?" Greg asked hopefully. "His fever's down slightly," she replied. "That's a good sign. The antibiotics may be starting to work." After she left, Greg returned to his one-sided conversation. "The whole town's talking about it, Frank, about you and that wolf. It's like something out of a storybook. Even the doctors don't believe it until I show them the pictures Tom took on his phone." Greg paused, struggling with whether to mention Martha. Frank deserved to know the truth, but in his current state, would such knowledge help or harm his chances of recovery? Greg decided to focus on positive news instead. "We're all pulling for you. The church is organizing a prayer vigil tonight." "Even old Jack Porter, who hasn't set foot in a church since his wife's funeral, says he'll be there." Greg smiled at the thought of the cantankerous former logger participating in anything communal. "You've got a lot of people in your corner, Frank, a lot of people who care." What Greg didn't add was the undercurrent of shame rippling through Clearwater, the collective guilt of a community that had failed to notice Martha's desperation until it was almost too late. Behind the prayer vigils and casseroles being delivered to the hospital waiting room was a painful self-examination. How had they all missed the signs? How had a woman known for her kindness been driven to such a desperate act without anyone intervening? Greg's permitted visiting time ended too quickly. With a final squeeze of Frank's hand and a promise to return tomorrow, he reluctantly left the ICU. In the hospital corridor, he checked his phone to find several missed calls from Sheriff Hudson and one from a number he didn't recognize with a Bozeman area code. He returned Bill's call first, receiving an update on Martha's house arrest and the pending charges. Then, curiosity piqued, he dialed the unknown number. "This is Dr. Elena Reyes from Montana State University's Wolf Research Program," answered a woman's voice with a slight accent. "I'm trying to reach Greg Thompson regarding the wolf encounter during yesterday's rescue operation." Greg confirmed his identity, wondering how news had traveled so quickly. "Mr. Thompson, what you've described is extraordinary from a behavioral perspective," Dr. Reyes continued, her voice animated with professional excitement. "A wild wolf actively protecting an injured human goes against everything we understand about Canis lupus behavior. I'd like to interview you about your observations and possibly access the area where this occurred." "It's a bit soon for that, don't you think?" Greg replied, irritation edging his tone. "My friend is fighting for his life." "I apologize for my timing," Dr. Reyes said quickly, "but this could be tremendously important for wolf conservation efforts. If we can document an example of complex empathetic behavior in wild wolves, it might change public perception and policy regarding these endangered animals." Greg softened slightly, remembering Frank's own respect for the wolves he encountered while hunting. "I'll tell you what, Doctor, when Frank's condition stabilizes, if it stabilizes, we can talk, but not before." As evening fell over western Montana, 3 individuals remained awake, separated by distance but connected by the extraordinary events of the past days. In Missoula, Greg Thompson dozed in an uncomfortable chair in the hospital waiting room, refusing to return to the hotel the hospital had arranged for him. He wanted to be nearby if Frank's condition changed, for better or worse. In Clearwater, Martha Miller sat alone in her kitchen, the ankle monitor a heavy reminder of her crimes against the foot of the table. On the table before her lay Frank's hunting journal, open to his detailed observations about the wolf called Gray. Martha read the entries repeatedly, trying to understand the cosmic irony that had placed her husband's life in the paws of a creature he had once spared. And deep in the Blackfoot forest, a silver-streaked wolf stood at the edge of the clearing where a man had lain for 3 days. The human scent was fading, diluted by rain and wind, but Gray remained, as if waiting for the return of the strange, helpless creature that had somehow awakened an ancient connection between their kinds. News of Frank Miller's extraordinary survival spread quickly beyond Clearwater. By morning, reporters from Missoula and even Helena had gathered outside Mercy Hospital eager for updates on the Wolf Man, as headlines were already dubbing him. The story captured public imagination: a paralyzed man abandoned in the wilderness, saved by a wild predator that logic dictated should have seen him as prey. Greg found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of spokesperson, fielding questions from the media while trying to protect Frank's privacy and dignity. He carefully avoided details about Martha's role, describing the situation vaguely as a tragic series of events currently under investigation. But rumors spread nonetheless, and by afternoon, the human element of betrayal had added another compelling layer to the already sensational story. Inside the ICU, Frank remained unaware of the commotion surrounding his case. His condition had stabilized overnight, the powerful antibiotics finally gaining ground against the infections. The medical team had cautious optimism, though Dr. Michaels warned Greg that Frank still faced a long and uncertain recovery. The sepsis is responding to treatment, and his vital signs are improving, the doctor explained during morning rounds. But the neurological impact of this trauma on someone already compromised by a stroke is difficult to predict. We'll know more when we can reduce the sedation. When will that be? Greg asked. Perhaps tomorrow, if his respiratory function continues to improve. Dr. Michaels made a notation in Frank's chart. There's something else you should know. We've had calls from several wildlife conservation groups and research institutions. Your friend's experience has attracted significant scientific interest. Greg frowned. Frank isn't a research subject. Of course not, the doctor agreed. But if his interaction with this wolf is as described, it represents a behavioral anomaly that could be important for understanding these animals. If Frank recovers sufficiently, he might consider sharing his experience. That'll be Frank's decision to make, Greg said firmly. Right now, all that matters is getting him well enough to make it. The doctor nodded respectfully and moved on to his next patient, leaving Greg alone with the rhythmic sounds of the life-supporting machinery and his own troubled thoughts. As remarkable as Frank's wolf encounter had been, Greg couldn't help feeling that the scientific community's fascination missed the point entirely. They wanted to study animal behavior, when what had occurred in that forest clearing seemed to transcend scientific categorization. It felt, though Greg hesitated to use the word even in his thoughts, almost spiritual. His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A hospital chaplain stood in the doorway, a gentle-faced woman in her 60s with a clerical collar and compassionate eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Reverend Collins, the hospital chaplain. May I come in?" Greg nodded, and she took the chair opposite him, her gaze taking in Frank's still form with professional assessment. "The nurses mentioned your friend's extraordinary story," she said. "I thought you might appreciate some company, or perhaps a prayer for his recovery." "Thank you," Greg replied, surprising himself with his gratitude for the offer. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but there was something comforting about the chaplain's calm presence in the sterile hospital room. Reverend Collins didn't launch immediately into prayer as Greg expected. Instead, she asked, "Were you there when they found him with the wolf?" "Yes, it was." Greg struggled to find adequate words. "I've never seen anything like it." This wild predator was standing guard over him, had been keeping him alive for days. When we approached, it positioned itself between us and Frank, ready to defend him. The chaplain nodded thoughtfully. Throughout human history, there have been accounts of unexpected mercy between species: St. Francis and the wolf of Gubbio, the lion that refused to harm Daniel, modern stories of dolphins protecting swimmers from sharks. She smiled gently. Science can explain some of these interactions, but not all. Sometimes I think we glimpse something deeper in such moments, a reminder of a world more unified than our everyday experience suggests. Greg found himself unexpectedly moved by her words. I kept thinking about how Frank had written about this particular wolf in his journal, how he'd had the animal in his rifle sights once but couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. And then this same wolf saves his life years later. It feels providential, Reverend Collins suggested. Maybe, or like some kind of cosmic balance being restored. Greg looked at Frank's unconscious form. I just hope he gets the chance to understand what happened. To know that when his own wife abandoned him, a wild animal chose to protect him. The chaplain's expression grew somber. I've heard rumors about his wife's involvement. How is she coping with what she did? Under house arrest and facing charges, Greg replied, a harder edge entering his voice. As she should be. Of course, there must be consequences for our actions, Reverend Collins agreed. But having worked in hospitals for 30 years, I've seen how caregiver burnout can push good people to breaking points they never imagined possible. Greg wanted to reject this perspective, to maintain his anger at Martha's betrayal of his friend, but found he couldn't entirely dismiss the chaplain's insight. He had seen Martha's deterioration over the 18 months of Frank's illness, had witnessed her transformation from devoted wife to hollow-eyed caretaker. He hadn't intervened effectively, none of them had, and that uncomfortable truth gnawed at his righteous anger. Their conversation was interrupted by a subtle change in the room's soundscape. One of the monitors had altered its rhythm. Frank's hand twitched on the blanket, his eyelids fluttering. Greg and the chaplain both rose, moving closer to the bed. "Frank, can you hear me?" Greg asked urgently. Frank's eyes opened partially, unfocused and confused. The ventilator prevented him from speaking, but his gaze eventually found Greg's face, recognition slowly dawning. "Don't try to talk," Greg said quickly. "You're in the hospital. You're safe now." Frank's eyes widened, darting around the room as if searching for something, or someone. When he didn't find what he sought, his gaze returned to Greg, a question clearly visible despite his inability to speak. "The wolf?" Greg guessed, understanding immediately what Frank was asking. "Gray is fine. He led us to you, protected you. He's back in the forest now." Relief visibly washed over Frank's features. His hand moved slightly on the blanket, fingers extending toward Greg in what appeared to be an attempt to communicate. Greg carefully took his friend's hand, mindful of the IV line. "I need to get the doctor," the chaplain said, already moving toward the door. Moments later, Dr. Michaels rushed in, quickly assessing Frank's awakened state. "This is excellent, Mr. Miller. You're doing much better than we expected at this stage." He performed a brief neurological examination, asking Frank to blink once for yes and twice for no in response to simple questions. "Do you know where you are?" One blink. "Do you remember what happened to you?" One blink. "Are you in pain right now?" Two blinks. The doctor seemed pleased with Frank's responses. "His neurological function appears intact, which is remarkable given the circumstances. We'll need to run more tests, but this is very encouraging." When the doctor finished his assessment, he turned to Greg. "He's still very weak, and we need to keep the ventilator in place for now, but short communication is possible with the blinking system we established." Greg nodded, returning to Frank's bedside once the doctor left. Frank's eyes fixed on him intently, clearly wanting to communicate something important. "Martha?" Greg guessed, dreading this inevitable question. Frank blinked once. "Yes." Greg hesitated, unsure how much to reveal in Frank's fragile state. "She's in Clearwater," he said carefully. "She's safe." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly, detecting the evasion. He managed to lift his hand a fraction, making a writing motion. "You want to write something?" Greg asked. One blink. Yes. Greg found a notepad and pen on the bedside table, positioning them where Frank could attempt to write despite his limited mobility. With tremendous effort, Frank managed to scratch out a shaky but legible word: nose. Greg understood immediately. Frank was asking if Martha knew he had survived. Yes, she knows you're alive. The sheriff told her yesterday. Frank's next question, painstakingly scrawled beneath the first: charges. Greg couldn't bring himself to lie. Yes, Frank, there will be charges. Attempted murder, most likely. Frank closed his eyes. Pain that had nothing to do with his physical condition etched across his features. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. His trembling hand produced one more word: fault. No, Greg said firmly, understanding Frank's meaning all too clearly. This is not your fault. Martha made her choice. No matter how difficult caring for you was, what she did was wrong. Frank shook his head weakly, frustration evident at his inability to fully express himself. He tapped the word he had written, then pointed to himself. Your fault? Greg repeated, confused. How could this possibly be your fault? Frank's hand moved again, writing with agonizing slowness. Emma, driving, covered. Greg stared at the words, their significance slowly dawning on him. Emma's accident, are you saying... He lowered his voice, though they were alone in the room. Frank, are you saying Martha was driving that night? Not you? One blink. Yes. And you took the blame? Greg whispered, stunned by this revelation. One blink. Yes. All these years everyone thought... Greg sat heavily in the chair beside the bed, processing this new information. The accident that had killed Frank and Martha's adult daughter 15 years ago had been a pivotal tragedy in their lives. Frank had admitted to driving while distracted, a momentary lapse that resulted in Emma's death. The community had eventually forgiven him, recognizing that no punishment could exceed the guilt he already carried. But if Martha had actually been behind the wheel... She was drunk, Greg realized aloud, pieces falling into place. And you protected her. One blink. Tears spilled from the corners of Frank's eyes, tracking silently down his hollow cheeks. Does she know that you know? Greg asked, still trying to absorb the implications of this confession. Two blinks. No. The revelation cast Martha's actions in a new, more complex light. The burden of secret guilt, compounded by Frank's stroke and her role as his caretaker, would have been crushing. Not that it justified abandoning him to die, nothing could justify that, but it helped explain how a woman who had once loved her husband deeply could commit such a terrible act. Frank was writing again, his hand shaking with fatigue but determined to communicate. Forgive her. Greg shook his head in disbelief. After what she did to you, Frank, she left you to die alone in the wilderness. But Frank's gaze was unwavering, his message clear. His next words, barely legible but unmistakable in their intent, not alone. Had Gray. The simple statement hung in the air between them, profound in its implications. Frank had not been abandoned by all creation. When humanity had failed him, nature itself had intervened through the unlikeliest of guardians. There was a lesson in that, a meaning that transcended the human drama of betrayal and guilt. Frank's eyes were growing heavy, the brief period of consciousness taxing his limited strength. Before he drifted back to sleep, he managed one final message. Tell her truth. Both free. As Frank slipped into healing sleep, Greg sat motionless beside him, contemplating the burden his friend had carried for 15 years and the extraordinary capacity for forgiveness he still possessed despite everything. The wolf had saved Frank's body, But perhaps the greater miracle was the preservation of his humanity, his ability to compassion after the ultimate betrayal. Outside the hospital room, the media frenzy continued, reporters crafting narratives about the Wolf Man of Montana without understanding the true complexity of the human story unfolding behind closed doors. They spoke of animal behavior and survival against odds, missing entirely the deeper currents of guilt, sacrifice, forgiveness, and redemption that flowed beneath the sensational surface. Greg Thompson sat in Sheriff Bill Hudson's office in Clearwater, the weight of Frank's revelation heavy on his conscience. Through the window he could see Martha Miller's house across the town square, its curtains drawn as if in mourning despite the fact that Frank was recovering, not deceased. 3 days had passed since Frank had regained consciousness, and Greg had finally returned to Clearwater to fulfill his friend's request, a task he approached with profound ambivalence. "You're sure about this?" Bill asked, leaning back in his creaking chair. "Frank wants you to tell Martha he knows about Emma, that he's known all along?" Greg nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. He was explicit, even in his condition. He wants her to know the truth before any legal proceedings begin. "It doesn't change what she did to him," Bill pointed out, his lawman's perspective firmly fixed on justice rather than reconciliation. "No, it doesn't," Greg agreed. "But it changes the context. Frank took the blame for their daughter's death to protect Martha. Carried that burden for 15 years while everyone in town, including me, believed he was responsible." Bill whistled softly. "That's one hell of a secret to keep." "And one hell of a weight for Martha to carry," Greg added. "Knowing her husband sacrificed his reputation to save her, then having to care for him after his stroke. I'm not excusing what she did, Bill, but I'm starting to understand it." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "The district attorney's been calling me every day about this case. Media attention is making everyone nervous. They want to make an example of Martha, show that elder abuse won't be tolerated." "What are you telling them?" "That it's complicated. That Frank doesn't want to press charges." Greg raised an eyebrow. "You told them that?" "Not in so many words," Bill admitted. "But I've made it clear that Frank's wishes need to be considered. Problem is, attempted murder isn't just a personal grievance, it's a crime against the state. The DA can proceed without Frank's cooperation." Greg stood, decision made. "Well, before anyone proceeds with anything, I need to talk to Martha. Frank was clear about that." "Want me to come with you?" Bill offered. "No." Greg shook his head. "This needs to be private. But thanks." The walk across Clearwater's town square took less than 5 minutes, but to Greg it felt like crossing a vast emotional distance. The town itself seemed subdued, as if holding its collective breath. Residents nodded to Greg as he passed, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. Everyone knew of his friendship with Frank, of his role in the rescue, and of the extraordinary story of the wolf that had captured national attention. Martha answered her door on the 3rd knock, her appearance shocking Greg despite his mental preparation. In just a week, she seemed to have aged a decade. Her silver hair hung limp and unwashed, her clothes were wrinkled as if slept in, and the vibrant woman who had once been known for her immaculate appearance at church socials now stood before him like a ghost of herself. "Greg," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "Is Frank—" "He's improving," Greg assured her quickly. "Still in ICU, but they've removed the ventilator. He's breathing on his own now." Relief flooded her hollow features. "Thank God. I've been praying, though I don't know if anyone's listening to my prayers anymore." She stepped back, gesturing woodenly. "Please, come in." The Miller home, once a showcase of Martha's homemaking skills, had fallen into disarray. Unwashed dishes filled the sink, mail was piled unopened on the table, and the faint smell of neglect permeated the air. Martha led Greg to the living room where the hospital bed remained, sheets stripped, but the frame still dominating the space, a physical reminder of the care burden that had driven her to desperate measures. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, a reflexive hostess even in her current state. "No, thank you. Martha, I need to talk to you about Frank. About something he asked me to tell you." She sank onto the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He must hate me now." "That's just it," Greg said, taking the chair opposite her. "He doesn't. In fact, he asked me to tell you that he forgives you." Martha's face crumpled, tears immediately spilling down her cheeks. "How can he? After what I did? I don't deserve forgiveness." "There's more," Greg continued, choosing his words carefully. "Frank wanted you to know that he understands why you broke. He said to tell you that he knows about Emma, about who was really driving that night." The color drained from Martha's face. For a moment, Greg thought she might faint. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, but her eyes betrayed the truth. Panic, recognition, the cornered look of a secret exposed. "Frank told me that you were driving when Emma died, that you'd been drinking at your anniversary dinner, that he took the blame to protect you from criminal charges and public shame." Martha stared at him, lips trembling, no longer bothering to deny it. "He knew? All this time?" "Yes, he's always known." The revelation seemed to physically strike Martha. She bent forward as if in pain, a keening sound escaping her throat. I thought he believed it was his fault, that he'd forgotten I was driving. The doctor said memory loss was common with trauma." "He remembered everything," Greg said gently. "He chose to protect you." "And I repaid him by abandoning him to die," Martha whispered, the full weight of her actions crashing down anew. "What kind of monster have I become?" Greg didn't offer platitudes or easy absolution. The question wasn't rhetorical, and they both knew it. Frank said something else. He said telling you the truth would free you both. Martha looked up, her tear-stained face a mask of confusion. "Free? How can either of us be free now?" "I think he meant from the secrets, from the guilt you've both been carrying." Greg leaned forward. "Martha, why did you leave Frank in the forest? The real reason?" She was silent for a long moment, gathering herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier, as if unburdening herself of one terrible secret had created space for another. "I couldn't bear it anymore. Not just the physical care, though God knows that was hard enough. It was looking into his eyes every day, seeing his kindness, his patience, knowing what he'd done for me." She twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit. "Every time I bathed him or changed him or fed him, I remembered that he should have let me go to prison. That's where I belonged. Instead, he sacrificed everything to protect me, and I grew to resent him for it, for his goodness, for the debt I could never repay." "So taking him to the forest was what? A way to balance the scales?" Martha shook her head vehemently. "No! I told myself it was mercy, ending his suffering, ending the financial drain that was consuming our savings. But that was a lie I created to live with myself." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The truth is, I couldn't stand my own reflection in his eyes anymore. Every time he looked at me, I saw the truth, that he was capable of a love I could never match, a selflessness I could never achieve, and it was unbearable." The raw honesty of her confession hung in the air between them. Greg had come expecting to find a monster, or at least a woman who had sacrificed her husband to escape the burden of his care. Instead, he found something more complex and perhaps more tragic, a soul crushed under the weight of undeserved grace. "Frank wants to see you," Greg said finally. Martha's head snapped up. "What? That's impossible. There's a protection order, which can be modified if Frank requests it. He's been asking for you every day." "I can't," Martha whispered, genuine terror in her eyes. "I can't face him. Not after what I did, not knowing what he did for me." "That's exactly why you need to face him," Greg insisted. "Frank is fighting to recover, Martha. His body is healing, but there's a deeper wound that only you can address." Martha stood suddenly, pacing the small living room with agitated steps. "You don't understand what you're asking. The shame. I can barely look at myself in the mirror." "How can I look at him?" "With the same courage he showed when he claimed responsibility for Emma's death," Greg answered simply. "With the same grace he's showing by asking for you now despite everything." "And then what?" Martha demanded, anger flaring momentarily through her grief. "I go to prison for attempted murder and Frank is left alone anyway. What's the point?" "The point is truth," Greg said firmly. "The point is clearing the air that's been poisoned by secrets for 15 years. What happens legally afterwards? That's for the courts to decide. But this conversation between you and Frank needs to happen regardless." Martha sank back onto the couch, the brief flare of resistance extinguished. "When?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow. I'll clear it with the sheriff and the hospital. I'll drive you there myself." As Greg left the Miller house, the weight of Frank's request temporarily lifted from his shoulders. He was struck by the complexity of human relationships, how love and resentment, sacrifice and betrayal could become so inextricably tangled that even the participants lost sight of where one ended and another began. Frank and Martha's marriage had collapsed under the weight of unspoken truths and asymmetrical sacrifice, yet even now, a thread of connection remained that neither betrayal nor time had completely severed. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of perfect autumn day that showcased Montana's rugged beauty. Greg arrived at Martha's house to find her waiting on the porch, dressed in her Sunday best as if attending church rather than visiting the husband she had left to die. The ankle monitor was visible beneath the hem of her skirt, a jarring contrast to her otherwise carefully assembled appearance. Sheriff Hudson was waiting in his patrol car, having agreed to escort them to Missoula rather than insisting Martha be transported in the back of a police cruiser like a common criminal. It was a small mercy that reflected the community's ambivalence about her case, condemning her actions while remembering her 4 decades of quiet service to the town. The drive to Mercy Hospital took just under 2 hours, conducted mostly in silence. Martha stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of her life recede as they traveled toward a confrontation she clearly dreaded. Occasionally her hand would rise to her throat, fingering the simple cross necklace she wore, a gesture halfway between prayer and nervous habit. At the hospital they were met by Dr. Michaels, who had been briefed on the unusual circumstances of this visit. "Mr. Miller is much improved," he informed them, his clinical tone softening slightly when addressing Martha. "His infections are responding well to treatment, and his cognitive function appears unimpaired by his ordeal. However, he remains very weak, and this visit must be brief." Martha nodded mutely, following the doctor's lead with the mechanical compliance of someone moving through a nightmare. Sheriff Hudson positioned himself outside Frank's room, close enough to intervene if necessary, but offering the illusion of privacy for the difficult conversation to come. Greg hesitated at the threshold. "Do you want me to come in with you?" Martha shook her head. "No. This is between Frank and me. It always has been." Watching her square her shoulders and step into the hospital room, Greg was reminded of someone approaching an execution chamber rather than a reconciliation. He took a seat in the waiting area, exchanging a somber nod with Bill Hudson. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say that would not feel trite in the face of the human drama unfolding behind that closed door. Inside the room, Martha stood frozen just inside the entrance, taking in the sight of her husband propped up against white pillows, his frame thinner than she remembered, face pale but eyes alert and tracking her movements. Various tubes and monitoring equipment surrounded him, beeping softly in the background like some electronic Greek chorus. "Martha," Frank said, his voice a hoarse whisper but unmistakably his own. "You came." The simple statement broke something inside her. Martha covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. "How can you even look at me?" she managed finally. "After what I did to you?" "Come closer," Frank requested, ignoring her question. "Please." Martha forced herself to approach the bed, each step an act of will against the instinct to flee. When she reached his side, Frank extended his hand, the one less encumbered by IV lines. After a moment's hesitation, Martha took it, surprised by the warmth and strength still present in his grip. "Greg told you?" Frank asked simply. Martha nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "About Emma, about how you protected me all these years." "I'm sorry," Frank said, the words so unexpected that Martha's gaze snapped to his face in confusion. "You're sorry? For what?" "For not telling you that I knew. For letting you carry that alone." Frank's voice was stronger now, determination lending it power. "I thought I was sparing you more pain. Instead, I created a debt you could never repay. That was cruel, even if I didn't intend it that way." Martha shook her head in disbelief. "Frank Miller, you cannot possibly be apologizing to me right now. I left you in the wilderness to die. I wanted you to die. Did you?" Frank asked gently. "Or did you want your pain to end? There's a difference." The distinction pierced Martha's armor of self-loathing. She sank into the chair beside his bed, still clutching his hand like a lifeline. "How can you possibly understand me better than I understand myself? Even now?" "Because I've loved you for 50 years, Frank answered simply. "Even when it was hardest. Even when you couldn't love yourself." Martha's tears flowed freely now, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not," Frank agreed, surprising her again. "Just like I didn't deserve yours after Emma died. But forgiveness isn't about deserving, Martha. It's about choosing to move forward instead of staying chained to the past." "There is no moving forward from this," Martha whispered. "I'm going to prison, and you'll be alone anyway." Exactly what I was trying to avoid by... She couldn't complete the sentence. "I was never alone in that forest," Frank said, his gaze distant for a moment. "Gray found me within hours, kept me warm through the night, brought me water, defended me from a bear. In my darkest moment, when I thought all was lost, I found connection with a creature I'd once spared from my rifle." Martha listened in wonder, having heard fragments of this extraordinary story, but never directly from Frank. "I've been thinking about it constantly," Frank continued, "about why a wild predator would protect a helpless human. The scientists have their theories, wolf behavior, anomalous compassion, who knows? But I think it was simpler than that. I think sometimes the universe creates balance. I showed mercy to Gray years ago. He returned that mercy when I needed it most." His eyes refocused on Martha, gentle but direct. "Just as I showed mercy to you after Emma's accident. The scales needed balancing there too, I suppose." "By my betraying you?" Martha asked, horrified by the implication. "No, by this moment now, by the truth finally being spoken between us." Frank squeezed her hand. "No more secrets, Martha. No more debts. Just two imperfect people who've hurt each other and been hurt by life." Martha struggled to absorb his perspective, to see past her crushing guilt to the possibility of something like grace. "How can you be this way, after everything?" "Near-death experiences have a way of clarifying what matters," Frank said with the ghost of a smile. "And what matters to me is that we stop poisoning ourselves with secrets and shame." Whatever happens legally, and I'll do everything in my power to speak for leniency, I want us to face it honestly." "I don't know if I can," Martha admitted, the prospect of public exposure terrifying after decades of maintaining a carefully constructed facade. "We'll find out together," Frank replied. "But first, there's something I need to show you." He reached for the small table beside his bed, where a tablet computer sat among the medical paraphernalia. With still, shaky hands, he activated the screen and navigated to a photo, which he turned to show Martha. The image took her breath away, a massive silver-gray wolf standing protectively over Frank's prone form in a forest clearing, yellow eyes fixed on the camera with unmistakable intelligence and determination. The raw power and beauty of the animal contrasted sharply with Frank's vulnerable condition, creating a tableau that seemed more mythic than real. "Tom Baker took this just before they reached me," Frank explained. "I want you to have a copy, to remember that even in our darkest moments, unexpected grace can find us. That's what I learned in the forest, Martha. That's what I hope we can both hold on to, whatever comes next." Martha studied the photo, transfixed by the wolf's piercing gaze. "He's magnificent," she whispered. "Yes, and he taught me something I should have learned years ago, that sometimes the greatest strength is in vulnerability. That sometimes we need to be broken before we can be truly healed." A soft knock at the door signaled that their time was running short. Martha looked up, panic flashing across her features at the thought of separation. "I'll be right here," Frank assured her, "not going anywhere this time." The simple promise, from a man who had every reason to withhold comfort, broke through Martha's final defenses. She bent forward, pressing her forehead against their clasped hands in a gesture of profound gratitude and remorse. "I don't know how to live with what I've done," she confessed in a broken whisper. "One day at a time," Frank replied, the wisdom of his 72 years evident in his gentle tone. "Just like I'll recover one day at a time. We start where we are, Martha, not where we wish we were." As Sheriff Hudson opened the door, indicating their visit had ended, Martha reluctantly released Frank's hand. The connection between them, damaged but not destroyed, altered but not eliminated, remained vibrant in the air between them as she was led away. Outside in the corridor, Martha turned to Greg, who had been waiting with the patient endurance of true friendship. "He's still Frank," she said wonderingly. "After everything, he's still himself." Greg nodded, understanding the miracle she was trying to articulate. In a world where trauma typically hardened hearts and narrowed perspectives, Frank Miller had somehow emerged from his ordeal with his humanity not just intact, but expanded. Like the wolf that had protected him against all natural instinct, Frank had transcended the expected response to betrayal and found something rarer and more valuable, the capacity to break the cycle of hurt with deliberate grace. As they left the hospital, Martha looked back at the building where her husband continued his improbable recovery. "The wolf saved his body," she murmured, more to herself than to Greg. "But I think he saved something in Frank's soul, too." Greg considered this as they walked toward the sheriff's car. "Maybe," he agreed. "Or maybe Frank already had that something, and the wolf just helped him remember it was there." The distinction hung in the air between them, a question without a simple answer, about the nature of compassion, about the capacity for forgiveness, about what truly makes us human in our finest moments. It was the same question that had captivated the media, the scientists, and everyone who heard the extraordinary story of Frank Miller and the wolf called Gray. Not just how such an unlikely salvation had occurred, but what it revealed about the mysterious connections that bind all living creatures in ways science alone could not fully explain. 3 months after his rescue from the Montana wilderness, Frank Miller stood at the window of his new cabin, watching snow drift lazily from a pewter-colored sky. The small, single-level structure sat on the edge of Greg Thompson's property, purpose-built for accessibility, with its wide doorways, grab bars, and absence of steps. Frank's recovery had progressed beyond the doctor's most optimistic predictions, though he still relied on a walker and would likely never regain the full use of his left side. The cabin's large windows faced the forest edge, offering an unobstructed view of the tree line where, several times a week, a familiar silver-gray figure would emerge from the shadows. Gray had become a regular visitor, maintaining a respectful distance from the cabin itself but making his presence known as if checking on Frank's well-being. This morning was no exception. The wolf appeared precisely at dawn, a ghostly sentinel against the pristine snow. "Morning, old friend," Frank murmured, raising his coffee mug in silent salute. The wolf's ears twitched, somehow sensing the greeting despite the distance and glass between them. He settled onto his haunches at the forest boundary, yellow eyes fixed on the cabin with the same watchful attention he had shown in those crucial days in the clearing. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew Frank's attention from the window. Greg's truck appeared around the bend, moving carefully on the snow-covered driveway. Frank knew immediately who the passenger would be. Today was Martha's first day of freedom since her sentencing 3 weeks ago. The legal proceedings had become a complex negotiation between justice and mercy, with the district attorney initially pushing for attempted murder charges while Frank steadfastly refused to testify against his wife. The resulting compromise reflected the case's unusual circumstances. Martha had pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of elder endangerment, with a suspended sentence of 5 years, mandatory counseling, and community service working with caregiver support organizations. Most significantly, the judge had taken the extraordinary step of ordering Martha to publicly disclose the truth about Emma's death, acknowledging that she, not Frank, had been driving intoxicated on the night of the fatal accident. This admission, 15 years delayed, had sent ripples of shock through Clearwater's close-knit community and forced a collective re-examination of the narrative they had constructed around the Miller family tragedy. Frank moved slowly to the door, his heartbeat quickening with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Despite their emotional reconciliation in the hospital, he and Martha had maintained limited contact during her legal proceedings, their conversations supervised and necessarily focused on practical matters. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter, one neither of them had been certain would ever arrive. The truck doors opened, and Greg emerged first, coming around to help Martha navigate the snowy path to the cabin. She moved with the hesitant steps of someone approaching unfamiliar territory, though Greg had brought her to see the cabin several times during its construction. Her face, partially obscured by a woolen scarf, appeared thinner than Frank remembered, the months of legal stress and public scrutiny having taken their visible toll. Frank opened the door before they could knock, standing in the entrance with his walker for support. "Welcome home," he said simply. Martha's eyes filled immediately with tears. "Home," she repeated, the word somewhere between a question and a prayer. Greg helped her up the gently sloped ramp, then tactfully excused himself. "I'll bring the rest of Martha's things this afternoon. Call if you need anything before then." With Greg's departure, Frank and Martha found themselves truly alone together for the first time since that fateful day in the forest. The silence between them hummed with unspoken questions and fragile hope. "Come in, out of the cold," Frank said finally, turning his walker with practiced ease. "Coffee's fresh." Martha followed him inside, removing her coat and scarf with mechanical movements. The cabin's interior was warm and bright, with simple, sturdy furniture arranged for both comfort and accessibility. Evidence of Frank's continuing rehabilitation was visible in the exercise equipment tucked discreetly in one corner, the medication organizer on the kitchen counter, the emergency call button mounted beside the bed. "It's lovely," Martha said, her eyes taking in the space that would now be their shared home. "You've made it so nice?" "Had help," Frank replied modestly. "Greg, Pastor Stevens, half the men in Clearwater pitched in. Small town has its advantages sometimes." Martha nodded, moving to the kitchen area where she automatically reached for a second mug, filling it from the coffee pot with the efficiency of long habit. The familiar domestic gesture seemed to steady her, providing a script when words failed. "How are you feeling?" she asked, handing him the mug. "Better every day," Frank answered truthfully. "Physical therapy's helping. Dr. Michaels says I'm defying all statistical recovery curves for someone my age." "You always were stubborn," Martha said, a ghost of their old banter surfacing briefly. Frank smiled, gesturing toward the window. "Come see something." Martha joined him, their shoulders not quite touching as they looked out at the snow-covered landscape. Her sharp intake of breath told Frank the moment she spotted Gray, still sitting motionless at the forest edge. "Is that Gray?" "Yes." Frank's voice softened with affection. "He comes most mornings, sometimes evenings too. Never approaches the cabin, never bothers anyone, just watches." Martha stared in wonder at the magnificent animal. "After all this time, he still remembers you." "Wolves mate for life," Frank said. "They remember their own for years, even when separated. Loyalty runs deep in their DNA." The unspoken parallel hung in the air between them, the contrast between the wolf's steadfast fidelity and Martha's momentary abandonment of her marriage vows. But Frank hadn't intended to wound with the comparison and quickly redirected. "The wildlife researchers from Montana State have been beside themselves," he continued. "They've set up cameras at the forest edge with my permission. Studying his behavior, trying to understand why he's maintained this connection." "Have they figured it out?" Martha asked, still watching the wolf with fascination. Frank shook his head. "Science has its limits. They can document the what, but not always the why, especially when it comes to behavior that defies natural patterns." Martha turned to face him fully, the question that had been hovering between them finally finding voice. "And us, Frank? Have you figured out the why for us?" The directness of her question, addressing their situation head-on rather than circling it cautiously, surprised and pleased him. The Martha he had known before his stroke would have approached the subject obliquely, if at all. "I've had plenty of time to think about it," Frank replied, moving to the small sofa where conversation would be more comfortable for his still recovering body. Martha followed, taking the chair opposite him rather than sitting beside him, another sign of her uncertainty about their new boundaries. "I believe what I told you in the hospital," Frank continued once they were settled, "that sometimes the universe creates balance, that mercy begets mercy and cruelty begets cruelty, but we get to choose which cycle we perpetuate." "You make it sound so simple," Martha said, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "But how do we just start over? After everything?" "Not over," Frank corrected gently. "I don't think we can go back to who we were before. Too much has happened. But we can start from where we are now. Two people who've hurt each other, who've seen the worst in each other, but who still remember the best, too." Martha's eyes filled with tears again, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I keep waiting for your anger, Frank." "It would be easier to bear than your kindness." Frank considered this, recognizing the truth in her words. Anger would provide a cleaner narrative, villain and victim, crime and punishment. His forgiveness complicated matters, forcing both of them to navigate more ambiguous emotional terrain. "I was angry," he admitted. "Those first hours in the forest after you left, I felt betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. But then Gray appeared, and something shifted." Frank leaned forward, his gaze intent. "When death seemed certain, when I was at my most vulnerable, I was shown extraordinary compassion from the most unexpected source. That changes a person, Martha. It reorganizes your understanding of what matters. Martha listened with rapt attention, hearing not just his words but the deeper current of meaning beneath them. And what does matter? After everything? Connection, Frank answered without hesitation. Not just between humans, but between all living things. The moments when we recognize ourselves in the other, when we choose compassion over self-interest. Gray had no reason to help me. By all natural law, I should have been easy prey, but something in him responded to something in me, some recognition that transcended species. He reached across the small space between them, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Martha took it, her fingers cold against his warm palm. "That's what I want for whatever time we have left," Frank continued. "Real connection. No more secrets. No more unspoken resentments. Just truth between us, however painful or healing it might be." "I'm afraid," Martha confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid I'll fail you again. Afraid I'm not capable of the kind of grace you're showing." "I'm afraid too," Frank acknowledged. "But I'd rather face that fear together than pretend it doesn't exist. The pretending nearly destroyed us, Martha. The perfect Christian couple, the devoted caregiver, the stoic patient, those were roles we played while our real selves were drowning underneath." Martha nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her tear-filled eyes. "No more roles," she agreed. "Just us, however broken or healing we might be." They sat in silence for a moment, hands still joined, the weight of their shared history and tentative future settling around them like the snow outside, covering the sharp edges of past pain without erasing the landscape beneath. A movement at the window caught their attention. Gray had risen from his watching position and was trotting along the forest edge, disappearing briefly behind a stand of pines before emerging again, something dark in his jaws. With deliberate steps he approached closer to the cabin than Frank had ever seen him venture, stopping about 50 feet from the building. There he placed his offering on the snow, what appeared to be a rabbit, and retreated several paces, watching the cabin with clear expectation. "What's he doing?" Martha asked, both alarmed and fascinated by the wolf's unprecedented behavior. "Bringing a gift, I think," Frank replied, equally surprised. "He's never done that before." "Should we accept it?" Frank considered the question, understanding its significance beyond the immediate situation. The wolf was offering something of value, food in the currency of his world. To refuse would be to reject not just the gift, but the relationship it represented. "Help me outside," he decided, reaching for his walker. Martha looked doubtful. "Frank, it's freezing out there. And your condition—" "I'll bundle up," he insisted. "This is important, Martha. Trust me." The concern in her expression was genuine, not the performative worry of a caregiver maintaining appearances, but she nodded and helped him into his heavy coat and boots. And together they made their way to the door and out onto the small, covered porch. Gray watched their emergence with alert attention, his massive head tilted slightly as if assessing the situation. When Frank raised his hand in greeting, the wolf's ears perked forward, his posture reflecting neither aggression nor fear, but a wary openness. "Thank you, friend," Frank called softly. "Thank you for the gift." Whether the wolf understood the words was impossible to know, but he seemed to grasp the acceptance they conveyed. With a final, penetrating look that seemed to encompass both Frank and Martha, Gray turned and loped back toward the forest, silver coat gleaming against the snow until he disappeared among the trees. "He brought that for you," Martha said wonderingly. "Like he's still taking care of you, even now." Frank nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Not just for me," he corrected gently. "Did you notice? He came closer when he saw both of us at the window. I think the gift was for our household, for our new beginning." Martha's expression reflected both wonder and uncertainty. Can it really be that simple? A new beginning? Simple doesn't mean easy, Frank reminded her, turning back toward the warmth of the cabin. We have hard work ahead, physical therapy for me, counseling for both of us, rebuilding trust day by day. But yes, I believe in new beginnings. I have to. As they made their way back inside, snow began falling more heavily, gradually covering Gray's tracks and his untouched offering. A ritual completed, its symbolic purpose served regardless of its practical utility. By nightfall, all evidence of the wolf's visit would be buried beneath fresh powder, but its meaning would remain, a foundation upon which Frank and Martha would build their uncertain future. In the weeks that followed, they established new rhythms and boundaries, learning to coexist not as caregiver and patient, but as equal partners in recovery, his physical, hers emotional and spiritual. There were difficult days when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm their fragile progress, when Martha would fall into periods of debilitating guilt, or Frank would struggle with the physical limitations that reminded him of his vulnerability. But there were also moments of unexpected grace, a shared laugh over dinner, the satisfaction of Frank taking his first steps without the walker, Martha's growing ease in talking about Emma without the shadow of unacknowledged guilt darkening her memories. Clearwater's response to their reconciliation reflected the complexity of small-town dynamics. Some residents maintained a cool distance, unable to forgive Martha's actions regardless of the circumstances. Others extended cautious support, bringing casseroles and offering practical help while reserving judgment on the moral dimensions of the situation. A few, particularly those who had experienced the grinding burden of elder care themselves, showed profound empathy for Martha's breaking point while still condemning her response to it. Pastor Stevens became a regular visitor, providing spiritual counsel that acknowledged the messy reality of human frailty rather than offering platitudes about divine forgiveness. Greg Thompson remained their steadfast ally, a bridge between the Millers and the community as they navigated their reintegration into Clearwater's social fabric. Through it all, Gray maintained his watchful presence at the forest edge, sometimes disappearing for days, but always returning, a living reminder of the extraordinary circumstances that had given Frank and Martha this improbable second chance. Wildlife researchers continued to monitor the wolf's unusual behavior, publishing preliminary findings that generated academic debate about interspecies bonding and the complexity of predator psychology. Frank fielded occasional interview requests from media outlets, still fascinated by the Wolfman of Montana story, accepting a few that allowed him to advocate for wolf conservation, but declining most in favor of the private healing work that consumed his and Martha's energy. The publicity had brought unexpected financial relief in the form of donations to help with Frank's medical expenses, easing one source of stress even as others remained. On a crisp February morning, 6 months after the day Martha had abandoned Frank in the wilderness, they sat together on the cabin's porch, bundled against the cold but determined to enjoy the winter sunshine. A comfortable silence had developed between them, not the loaded quiet of unspoken resentments that had characterized their pre-stroke marriage, but the peaceful stillness of two people who had said the hard things and found themselves still standing afterward. "I saw Judy Wilson at the grocery store yesterday," Martha said, breaking the silence. "She actually smiled at me. First time since, well, you know." Frank nodded, understanding the significance of this small gesture from one of Clearwater's most judgmental residents. People's memories are shorter than their proclamations suggest. Give it time. "It's not their forgiveness I'm worried about," Martha admitted. "It's my own. I still wake up sometimes remembering how I left you there. How cold it was. What could have happened?" "But it didn't happen," Frank reminded her gently. And focusing on what could have been keeps us trapped in the past. I'm more interested in what could be. Martha turned to him, curiosity in her expression. And what do you see when you look forward, Frank? What could be for us now? Frank considered the question seriously, his gaze drifting to the forest edge where Gray made his regular appearances. I see us growing old together, properly this time, not just aging side by side without really seeing each other. I see us speaking truth, even when it's uncomfortable. I see us honoring Emma's memory by living honestly in a way we couldn't, while carrying the secret of her death. He reached for Martha's gloved hand, squeezing it gently. And I see us remembering what that wolf taught us, that compassion can emerge from the most unexpected places, that grace doesn't follow the rules we think it should, that sometimes the wild parts of ourselves are wiser than our civilized facades. Martha's eyes filled with tears, but they were no longer the tears of guilt and shame that had dominated their early reunion. "I want that future," she whispered. "I want to be worthy of this second chance." "Then we'll build it together," Frank promised. "One day at a time, just like my recovery, just like your healing." A movement at the tree line caught their attention. Gray emerging from the forest, accompanied by another wolf, slightly smaller with darker coloring. The pair paused at the boundary that Gray never crossed, the second wolf hanging back with apparent caution, while Gray sat in his usual watchful position. "He's brought a friend," Martha observed, wonder in her voice. "A mate, possibly," Frank suggested. "Spring will be coming soon. New beginnings all around." They watched in companionable silence as the wolves surveyed the cabin before melting back into the forest together, disappearing among the trees that had once been the setting for abandonment and salvation, betrayal and redemption. The parallel was not lost on either of them, two pairs finding their way forward after periods of solitude, navigating the delicate balance between independence and connection. As the sun began its early winter descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, Frank and Martha returned to the warmth of their shared home. The future stretched before them, uncertain in its details but grounded in a hard-won truth, that even the deepest wounds could become sites of healing, that betrayal need not have the final word, and that sometimes, in the wilderness of our greatest despair, unexpected grace finds us and leads us home. In Clearwater, Montana, the story of Frank Miller and the wolf called Gray would eventually become local legend, told and retold with the embellishments that naturally accrue to extraordinary tales. But for Frank and Martha, it remained something more intimate and profound. Not just a miraculous survival story, but a template for their ongoing journey together. A reminder that the line between abandonment and rescue, between cruelty and compassion, often hinges on choices made in our darkest moments. And sometimes, in the space between heartbeats, in the pause before decision, something ancient and wordless speaks through us. The same wild wisdom that had led a predator to protect rather than devour, that had enabled a betrayed husband to forgive rather than condemn, that continues to whisper in the silence between all living things. We are more connected than separated, more alike than different, more capable of grace than we dare to believe. Dear friends, when Martha abandoned her paralyzed husband Frank in the wilderness, she never imagined a wild wolf would become his guardian angel. This remarkable true story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when relationships fracture, health fails, or caregiving becomes overwhelming, unexpected grace can find us. Frank and Martha's journey from betrayal to healing shows that it's never too late for a new chapter. After decades of marriage poisoned by unspoken truths and burden, they found something precious. Authentic connection built on honesty rather than obligation. Like the wolf Gray who defied natural instinct to protect a vulnerable stranger, we too can choose compassion over resentment, truth over comfortable lies. Whether you're facing retirement challenges, health concerns, or relationship difficulties, remember Frank's wisdom. We start where we are, not where we wish we were. Have you experienced an unexpected moment of grace during your most difficult times? Or is there a relationship in your life that needs the healing power of honest conversation? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be the light someone else needs today.